things and how the living things are classified. Okay? The problem is there are so many living things on the earth. Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, tiny little microscopic organisms, gigantic organisms, all kinds. So the question then is, how do we, as scientists, how do we organize them or group them up? Otherwise, it's this huge mess of living things, and we have no idea where each one of them belongs. So the system of classification is the system of organizing living things. Okay, now it's only living things. We don't classify rocks in the same categories. We don't classify landforms, things like that. We don't classify molecules in these things. Okay, only things that are living. Okay, nod your head if you understand what I'm saying. All right, good deal. So we're going to begin reading on page 150 about classification. Have we popcorn read in here before?
Yes.
No.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have.
Not in this
Okay.
book.
So what we're going to do, and I'm recording this for the online kids, so I will do a good majority of the reading just so they can hear, but they do have their own copies. So they can kind of follow along as we go. But I will read, and then I will call on students to pick up where I left off. If you don't know where we are, I see your hand, just hold on. If you don't know where we are when you get called on, you get a warning. Okay? You have to be following along with us. When I popcorn, I'll popcorn to either a boy or a girl. If I popcorn to a boy, they read for 2 paragraphs and then popcorn to a girl. If I call on a girl, they read for 2 paragraphs and popcorn to a boy. It's pretty simple. Okay? And we'll stop along the way. I have lots of things to show you because this requires a lot of explaining. Okay? So, we're on page 150. Talking about classification. All right. Yes, Nicholas. They do look kind of, they're cartoons. Okay, here we go. Classification. Do you collect baseball cards, coins, CDs, or even rocks? If so, you probably organize the items to make them easy to find. Scientists have a system for keeping track of the millions of different organisms that live on Earth. They classify or organize the organisms into groups based on similar characteristics. Okay, so this is an example I gave the other class. If I took all this stuff out of my pencil holder, okay, and I wanted to organize it, I would start by separating it into groups based on characteristics, right? So I could say, okay, let me separate it into all of the writing utensils, all of the non-writing utensils. Okay, so all the things that you don't use to write can go over here. All the writing utensils go over here. Okay, well, that's one group already, correct? Now, I would further classify them. Okay, I could do pens and pencils. So I would separate all the pens and pencils. Then I could go into colored pencils and regular pencils, blue pens, black pens, etc., right? I could keep organizing and grouping things based on characteristics, right? I could do the same thing with our class. I could say, hey, I want to take all the students in my class and I want to classify them. Well, first thing I would do is separate it into 2 groups based on one characteristic. I'd probably do boys and girls. Okay? Then I could take both of those 2 groups and further classify them. Boys with dark hair, boys with light hair. Girls with dark hair, girls with light hair. Okay? Then I could keep going. I could say, okay, boys that have sisters, or boys with dark hair that have sisters, boys with dark hair that don't have sisters. Okay? Then I could do boys with light hair that have sisters, boys with light hair that don't have sisters, and keep going. You see what I'm saying? The further you keep grouping and classifying, the more groups you get. And the more specific you get. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what it means to classify. You do it all the time. You just don't think about it. When you go to the grocery store and you get home, you got to unload all the groceries. Okay? What's the first thing you do? Well, you separate it into what goes in the fridge, the freezer, and the pantry. Mm-hmm. Then you go from there. Right? Mm-hmm. You do this all the time. You just don't normally think about it in terms of science. Okay? So classifying is separating into groups based on characteristics. Parker, make it quick. Well, I would pick one, I'm sure. The Greek philosopher Aristotle was the first person known to classify living things scientifically. In his classification system, living things were classified as animals or plants. Aristotle later divided each of these large groups into smaller groups. For example, plants were divided into herbs, shrubs, or trees. Animals were classified according to where they lived, on land, in water, or in the air. Nearly 2,000 years later, the Swedish biologist Carolus Linnaeus, say Carolus?
Carolus
Linnaeus created a different classification scheme. His idea was to group animals and plants based on similarities in their structures. For example, Linnaeus placed animals into groups based on whether or not they had a backbone. Read this purple bubble, please. Bella, nice and loud.
Today, scientists still compare the structures of organisms to classify them. They also look at features such as how an organism moves, gets food, and produces more of its own kind.
Like Aristotle, Linnaeus divided living things into two large groups, plants or animals, called kingdoms. But tools and technology available to today's scientists have allowed them to study organisms more closely. Scientists now realize that some organisms don't quite fit into the plant or animal group. As a result, several other kingdoms of organisms are now recognized. And we're going to read about all of them. Classification, hierarchy. Say hierarchy.
Hierarchy.
Good. Bella, you can pop her into a boy. Nicholas, what's your question? Okay. 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 Yeah, I don't know. There's probably lots of different species. All right, Bella, popcorn to a boy, please.
Do they
Ethan, you
have
have
to
to
be
wait.
raising their hand?
No, any boy. You don't know where we are.
No, I don't want to leave. I know where we are.
Oh, well, too bad. Well, come on, let's go. I'm not really giving you an option. Let's go.
Classification
Hierarchy.
hierarchy is a system used to organize into groups the many different organisms found on Earth. Swedish biologist Carolus
Linnaeus.
Linnaeus developed the first modern classification
Hierarchy.
hierarchy. The system has changed since
Linnaeus.
Linnaeus' time. It continues to change as scientists learn more about organisms and the system used to do. The groups that have the largest number of different organisms are called domains.
Mm-hmm.
There are three domains:
Archaea,
Archaea,
Bacteria, Eukarya. Mm-hmm.
The next level in the
Hierarchy.
hierarchy is kingdom. The domain
Archaea.
Archaea, Bacteria have only one kingdom each. The domain hierarchy was four kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, and
Protists.
protists.
Yeah, you got all those Latin words there. The kingdom level is broken down into 6 smaller levels. These include phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Each level contains fewer types of organisms than the level before. The species level includes only one type of organism. Organisms also become more closely related as you move from the kingdom to the species level. Okay, look up here. So, here's what we have. You don't have to write this down. You're going to get notes over all of this. But this is just easier to explain if you see it as we go. Okay, so all living things, every single living thing in the entire world, everything starts, let me turn this a little bit so they can see me. Okay, everything starts with domain. That's the highest level of organization. Okay? You look at every single living thing, and the first thing you say is, okay, which domain does it go in? This is like dividing into boys and girls, right? My first level of grouping. Okay? There are 3 domains. So we draw 3 boxes. Okay? The first one is Archaea. I'm sorry, not Archaea. The first one is Eukarya. Okay? You'll notice that a lot of these names end in either a or ae. Okay? That's because these are Latin names. When we talk about classification, almost everything is in a Latin name. Okay? So Eukarya comes first. Then we have Archaea. Then we have Bacteria. Okay? Now, the question then is, how do we know which group it goes into? Well, you have to look at what kind of cells they are made of. Raise your hand if you've heard the word cells before. Very good. Okay? All living things are made of these tiny microscopic structures called cells. Yes? It's the smallest living thing there is a cell. So, when looking at the cell, there's 2 different types of cells. When you put a little cell under a microscope, and when I mean cell, I mean like if I pricked my finger and had a drop of blood right here, that would be thousands of cells. Okay? They are super duper tiny. So, when we look at a cell under a microscope, there's 2 different ways they can look. The first type is how eukarya looks. Okay? So you have a cell kind of like this, and there's this ball in the center of it. Okay? The center of the ball is called the nucleus. Okay? Inside of this nucleus is all kinds of stringy stuff. It's kind of like noodles. Okay? It's the DNA. In a eukaryote type cell, this is where we get the name eukarya from, the cell has all of that stringy stuff is trapped inside of the nucleus. It's all balled up. Okay? For Archaea and Bacteria, both of these domains have a cell, similar shape, but the inside looks like this. Okay? That stringy stuff is not balled up inside a nucleus, but it's floating all around the cell. Okay? That's called a prokaryotic cell. This is a prokaryote cell. This is a eukaryote cell. Okay? So if I gave you any random organism, the first thing you would do to figure out which domain it goes into is you would get its cells, look under a microscope, and decide, does it have a nucleus or does it not? If it does, it's going to go here. If it does not, it will go in one of these 2. And then we'll look at further characteristics to see which group it goes in. Okay? Now, that's the topmost, most general level. Underneath domain, our next level of organization is called kingdom. Okay? For eukarya, there are 4 kingdoms. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to draw 4 boxes here. And again, next week you'll get notes with all of this stuff in it. Okay? So don't worry about memorizing it right now. Eukarya has 4 kingdoms. The first one is Animalia, or the animal kingdom, the one you're probably most familiar with. Next is the plant kingdom, which we call Plantae. That's the Latin name for it. Next is Fungi. And the last one is Protista, or the Protist kingdom. Okay? Now, what that means is because all of these fall under the eukarya domain, they are all made of cells that look like this. Okay? All of their cells have a nucleus. Now, Archaea and Bacteria, Archaea only has 1 kingdom, with a very long name, and Bacteria only has 1 kingdom as well. Okay? The kingdom for domain Archaea is Archaea Bacteria. It's easy to remember because it's the first part is exactly like the domain name, Archaea Bacteria. And then Bacteria's kingdom is Eubacteria. Okay? Every organism in both of these kingdoms is made of cells that look like this. Okay? Now, after domain, yikes, that was too dark. After domain and kingdom, the rest of the classification levels go like this. We have domain, kingdom, then we go to phylum, then we go to class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay? Now, just like with the order of the planets, remember how we had my very educated mother just served us nachos?
Mm-hmm.
For this, the sentence is, Dear King Philip came over for great spaghetti. Dear King Philip came over for great spaghetti. Okay? Now, again, you'll get notes with all of this in it. But my point is this. From here, we can separate these into further and further and further groups. There are millions of different types of animals, right? Millions. I mean, there's thousands of types of butterflies alone. Okay? So, when we get into the animal kingdom, we'll learn that the animal kingdom is divided into 2 different phylum groups. Okay? So, we'll go from here into 2 different phylum groups. Then, from the phylum, we'll go into separate classes. Some of these contain like 8 or 9 classes. Okay? And everything keeps branching off from there. Then they would divide it into orders. Then they would divide it into families. Then genus. Then species. Okay? It just keeps going on and on and on. But the system helps us organize animals and see how they relate to one another. All living things, really. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stop here at kingdom. We're going to read about a little bit about each of the different kingdom types. Okay? Landon.
So, I have 2 questions, but depending on the third, the first one is the second one.
Okay.
Is a molecule smaller than
Yes.
So, are molecules considered living?
No. Good question. The smallest type of living thing is a cell. Once you get smaller than that, it is no longer living on its own. Yes.
Oh, there's like words.
Just ignore it. Connor?
On page 35-96, it shows the nucleus and
Good. We're going to have another one that shows nucleus in just a little bit. Go back to where we are. All right. Now, going down below that, let me finish this page and then I'll call on someone to read. Oh, this blurb just tells you the Dear King Philip thing that I just told you. Okay? Sometimes there is a great variety within a species. Some breeds of dog, for example, look very different from others. However, these different-looking dogs can still mate with one another to produce young. Different dog breeds are varieties of the same species. Organisms are called by their scientific name, which we'll get to in just a little bit, which consists of their genus and species name. For example, the domesticated dog, or the kind that you would keep in your house, is known as Canis familiaris. Okay? And we'll talk about the scientific names in a little bit. All right, for kingdoms. All right? I'm going to call on people to read about each of these kingdoms, but there are 4 questions I want you to try to answer for each kingdom. Okay? So we're going to pause after each reading and try to answer these 4 questions. Okay? So, for example, our first one is plant kingdom. After we read this, we're going to try and answer how many cells make up the organisms in that group. Okay? Are they made of one cell or are they multicellular, meaning many cells put together? How does it eat? Does it make its own food or does it eat other things? Nicholas, you with me? You're on the wrong page. Number 3, cell structure. Does the cell have a cell wall or not? A cell wall is when the cell has an extra layer around the outside. Almost like an extra brick wall around the outside that gives it more support. Makes it a little bit more structured. Okay? So, does its organisms have a cell wall or no? And then number 4, how does it reproduce? All right? So, try and find at least one of those questions in the reading. Capiche? All right. Hannah Payne, go ahead and start reading, please, underneath kingdoms. Huh? Oh, you were. Hey, hold on, Hannah. Connor, go ahead and popcorn. Yep.
Get it anyway.
Perfect. Hannah.
From the earliest classification systems of life, organisms are classified into the plant or animal. Since then, scientists have discovered that many organisms have two different types in the cells of plants. For this reason, 6 kingdoms of organisms are generally recognized: plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, and Archaea.
Plant kingdom.
Plant kingdom. From the mighty oak to common crop, all members of the plant kingdom are made of many cells that are surrounded by cells. All plants with ground food is photosynthesis. Some groups of plants are mosses, ferns,
Conifers.
and flowers. Flowering plants produce seeds and flowers, while conifers make seeds and fruit. Mosses and ferns produce like wool.
Good. All right. So, looking at our questions here. Let me get to a new page. And we'll try to answer them. Okay. So, wow.
Nice.
Okay. For the plant kingdom. Okay. How many cells make up the organisms within the plant kingdom? Let me give you a hint. If they are made of one cell, they're microscopic. Connor, what are you doing? What are you doing? Okay, shut up. We're learning here. If it's made of one cell, it's microscopic. If you can see it without a microscope, it is multicellular. Okay? Sophie. Good. It is multiple cells. So, we're going to say multicellular. That's the word for multiple cells, like multi as in multiple. Okay? How does it eat? Does it make its own food, or does it eat other things? Reagan?
It makes its own food by photosynthesis.
Good. Makes its own food. Cell structure. Does it have a cell wall or no? Landon? Good. It has a cell wall. So if you were looking at an organism and saw the cells had a cell wall, it's probably going to go in the plant kingdom. Hannah, make it really fast. How does it reproduce? Ethan?
So while on the plant produce seeds, and then reproduce by making spores.
Good. Usually seeds, sometimes spores. Okay? Yes.
For some reason, whenever I think of photosynthesis and food for plants, I always think it's sweet. I don't know why. Like the flowers over there in the grammar school, we always used to pick them off and suck the nectar.
The honeysuckle?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nectar is sweet, but
I feel
that's
like
not their
that's what
food.
it would taste like.
Maybe. All right, Animal Kingdom. Oh, Hannah's not here. Popcorn 2, Parker.
Oh, wow. Wait. About the spores.
Okay, make it really fast.
About the spores, there's a type of moss that
Yes.
actually combusts and shoots out spores.
Yep, we'll learn about that in the spring.
Yeah.
All right, Parker. Animal Kingdom.
Members of the animal kingdom are made up of many cells. All animals get their energy by eating other organisms. Animals are divided into 2 large groups: invertebrates, which without reference, and protists. Within them are invertebrates like sponges, jellies, sea stars, insects, fish, frogs, lizards, peacocks, and things are all.
Good. Okay, turn the page. But before we begin reading again, how many cells does it take to make up an organism in the animal kingdom? Are they made of one cell or many? Connor? Many. So they are also multicellular. How does it eat? Nathan?
It eats other.
Good. Eats other things. Cell structure. Does it have a cell wall or no? Hattie? No. No cell wall. And then how does it reproduce? This is not actually in the reading, and I bet you're not going to be able to guess it. Trinity? You're correct, but they all have something in common. They do have to mate, so it's sexual reproduction, meaning there's two types of DNA that have to come together. Okay? Bless you. But, well, I'm going to blow your mind. You ready?
No.
All animals start off as eggs.
What?
Every single one.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Whoa.
They start off as eggs.
This is why. Now, what I mean is, every single organism in the animal kingdom, including humans, start off as eggs. Not the kind of egg you're thinking of. A type of cell called an egg cell.
Oh.
Okay. That egg cell sometimes develops.
It's on 102.
Okay, well, we're not. Nope. Listen. Sometimes that egg cell grows and develops into a literal egg that the animal then lays and the egg hatches outside the body, right? Like a bird or a reptile or a fish egg, things like that. Sometimes that egg cell develops into an actual living being inside of the mother and it's born live, like dolphins, whales, humans, lions, things like that, any kind of mammal. Okay? So, but they all start off as egg cells. Pretty interesting. Okay? Turn the page. We're going to go on to fungi. Parker, keep reading.
Fungi are single organ-cell organisms that reproduce by spores. Like plants, the cells of fungi are surrounded by cell walls. However, these cell walls are made up of called chips,
Chitin.
For example, one cell fungi include yeast and some birds. Other fungi include mushrooms, fungi, and puffballs. Unlike plants, fungi lack chlorophyll and so cannot photosynthesize. They can get their energy by food on the living or
Good. All right, fungi. How many cells? One cell or many celled? Landon? Some of them are one. Both. Some of them are multi, some of them are singular. So we're going to say multi / unicellular. Okay? Unicellular is the word we use for one celled. Okay? How does it eat? Trinity? So does it make its own energy or eat other things? Very good. Eat other things. Cell wall or no? Nicholas? Cell wall or no? What do you think? Yes or no?
I don't know.
A little bit of both, actually. There are some that do have a cell wall and some that don't. Actually, no, wait. It does say.
It says that.
Yeah, no, it does have cell wall. But the difference between fungi cell wall and plant cell wall is the fungi cell walls are made of a material called chitin. Okay? You don't have to really know that necessarily, but plant cell walls are made of cellulose. Okay? And then how does it reproduce? Ethan?
Well, I can answer that, but then, I always thought it was pronounced chitin.
Chitin? No, chitin.
Well, they reproduce in spores.
Yes. That's correct. Spores. It says. Oh, it doesn't say that. Sorry. It is true.
Where?
It says it top. It says it first.
Oh yeah, reproduce by spores in the first sentence. Okay. Popcorn to a girl, please. Protist kingdom. Hannah, question? What?
Well, I just want to say, at my house, in my backyard, there's a log. It's like moldy and it has like shells.
Yeah?
Like a big fat mushroom like this big.
Yep. Very true. For you, girl. Sophie, protist. We gotta hurry, guys.
The first stage is made up of one cell and several many cells. The nucleus of first cells is enclosed and
Uh-huh.
some protists
amoeba,
and
paramecium,
feed on other organisms. Others, such as fungi,
euglena.
many types of algae, make their food photosynthesis.
Very good. All right. For the protist kingdom, how many cells? Reagan.
It can be one or many, so it's both.
Good. It is both. Most of the time, it's unicellular. Most of our examples are microscopic unicellular, but they can sometimes be multi. Okay? Now, that's what's interesting about Protista. Okay? Of all the kingdoms within the eukaryote domain. Okay? So all of these organisms are all made of cells that look like this, meaning they have a nucleus, right? Of all these kingdoms, Protista is Fungi. He's the only one that can have a unicellular eukarya organism. Okay? He's the only one that has a cell that looks like this, but his entire body is just made of one of them. Okay? So because of that, he's very similar to these two kingdoms. Both Archaea bacteria and eubacteria are microscopic one-celled organisms, usually. Okay? But the difference is Protista's cells look like this, while these guys' cells look like this. Okay? All right. For answer the questions. So, for Protista, it's unicellular or multi. How does it eat? Does it make its own food or does it eat other things? Look at the paragraph. What do you think, Ethan? It what? It does feed on other organisms, and sometimes it can make its own. So it can make its own or feed on others. Just depends. Depending on the type, it could photosynthesize and make its own energy, or it may have to consume something else. Cell structure. Does it have a cell wall? On 3. 1, 2, 3. No, it does not. And then how does it reproduce? The paragraph does not tell you this, but Protista is also cool because it clones itself. Okay? It reproduces by splitting or budding, which we'll talk about in the notes when we get there in a little bit. Okay? Okay, for Archaea bacteria and eubacteria, these are very similar. They're also not very complex organisms. So we're not going to answer these 4 questions yet after the reading, but when we get into the notes, we'll talk about them a little more. Okay? So you read 1 or 2? Or who was reading? Read 1? Okay. Archaea bacteria and eubacteria, Sophie.
Members of these two kingdoms are single cell organisms that lack external nucleus. Synthesis and substances that make up these organisms have less characters to classify them
Archaea bacteria.
Archaea bacteria is only kingdom in Germany.
Archaea.
Most Archaea bacteria live in extreme environments, such as hot springs, very salty water, and soft mud. Most Archaea bacteria die in the presence of oxygen. Bacteria is the only kingdom in the genus bacteria. Bacteria are found in many different types, including soil, water, other living organisms. Strong bacteria need oxygen, others die. Most bacteria feed off other organisms. However, some such as
Cyanobacteria. Good. So again, we'll get to talking about these guys a little bit more into the notes. So we're going to read this last page here, major groupings of organisms, and then we have a couple things to update on our chart that I wrote up here, and then we'll be done. Ethan, is this like utterly important? Oh, I see. Is this utterly important? Okay. Sophie, popcorn to a boy, please. Maybe Ethan, because he's dying to read. Is that who you picked? Okay.
One way to classify organisms is according to their place of kingdom. Scientists also find it helpful to look at how organisms can be grouped together according to their general characteristics. For example, we can create a group for all organisms that make their own food and organisms that cannot make it. Vertebrates and autotrophs.
Heterotrophs, autotrophs.
One way organisms are classified is according to how they get their food. Plants, algae, and some bacteria make their own food through photosynthesis. Organisms that make their own food are called autotrophs, a term meaning self-feeding.
Good.
Like other animals, you obtain food from other organisms. Any organism that uses another as its source of food is classified as a heterotroph.
Heterotroph. Good. All right. The prefix auto. Okay. Where else do we see this prefix auto? What other words have auto at the beginning? Nicholas, pick your head up. Hannah. Autograph. Writing your own name, right? Bella.
O'Reilly.
Auto parts, which is a shortened form of automobile, right? A car that moves on its own. It doesn't need something else to move it. It moves with the power of the engine. Reagan? Autobiography, the writing of your own life, right? So what can we assume this prefix auto means?
Right.
Writing your own story about your life, writing your own name, a car moving on its own. Connor?
It can do something on its own.
Very good. It can do it on its own. It means self. So, troph has to do with eating. When you are a self-feeder, that means you make energy on your own. It does not mean that you feed yourself. Okay? Obviously, you feed yourself. But you, inside of your own body, our bodies do not make food inside of us. We are not self-feeders. Okay? However, plants are. Plants do make their own food inside of their bodies. Okay? That's an autotroph. A heterotroph, the prefix hetero, means other or different. Okay? If you are an other feeder, you have to feed on something other than yourself. Okay? So, if we go back and change these to either autotroph or heterotroph, what would we call the plant kingdom that makes its own food? What is the term for that? Autotroph or heterotroph? Raise your hand if you think autotroph. Raise your hand if you think heterotroph. Raise your hand if you didn't raise your hand. Autotroph.
Yeah.
Okay? What about the animal kingdom? Eats other things. Is that a self-feeder or an other feeder? Raise your hand for autotroph. Raise your hand for heterotroph. There we go. Good.
Yeah.
Heterotroph. Fungi eats other things. Raise your hand for autotroph. Raise your hand for heterotroph. If it eats other things, it's a heterotroph. I'm telling you because you raised your hand for autotroph. And then protista. Makes its own or could eat others. Raise your hand for autotroph. Raise your hand for heterotroph. Good. It's both.
I raised my hand. Me too.
I thought there was going to be a third option, so
Nope.
I just kept it down.
We just say, depending on what kind it is, it could be an autotroph, could be a heterotroph. Okay? All right. Last two words we need to know, and then we're going to be done. Follow along. Organisms can be classified according to whether or not their cells contain membrane-bound structures. Single-celled organisms that do not have membrane-bound internal structures are called prokaryotes. Say prokaryotes.
Prokaryote.
Good. All Eubacteria and Archaea bacteria are prokaryotes. The cells of most other organisms contain membrane-bound structures known as organelles. We'll learn about organelles in December. Organisms made up of cells that have organelles are called eukaryotes. Say eukaryotes.
Eukaryote.
Eukaryotic cells tend to be much bigger than prokaryotic cells. Okay? Look at the pictures. This is what I was drawing for you earlier on the chart that I drew. Okay? The eukaryotic cell is the one that looks like this. Okay? All of that stringy noodle-like DNA is wrapped up inside the nucleus. Okay? That's a eukaryote. It has a membrane-bound organelle. The membrane is like a little tiny lining to the nucleus that holds it all together. Okay? The Archaea and Bacteria domains are prokaryotes. That's the kind that does not, all that stringy stuff is not contained in a membrane. Okay? So here's another diagram of it. Prokaryote, eukaryote.